My name is Mr. Lagerway, and I'm an APUSH teacher up in Michigan, and today we're talking about period 3, and evidently I'm better at APUSH than I am with my microphone, so apologies there. Glad to have you folks with us, and a couple things before we get started. Remember, there is that chat function over on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm going to be paying attention to that as we go through the evening, not only so that you can tell me, hey, your sound isn't working, but also so that way you can be able to answer some questions that I'm going to be asking of you. You can ask me questions. The more interactive this is, the better it goes, and the more fun it is for everybody involved. So that'll be fantastic. And then also keep in mind there is the ask a question function at the bottom of the screen. And if you'd like to ask a bigger question that you want me to answer at the end of the live stream, if it's something that's going on in the middle of the live stream, feel free to put it there too. But that's a great way to make sure that I'm able to see your question, especially if it's a bigger question. And you can go in there and you can vote for other people's questions to be able to see which ones you'd really want to see answered, and those go to the top of the queue, and thus I'm able to answer those. I will try to keep it confined to the topics at hand, at least until we get to the very end, and then we'll kind of open it up to other questions that you have about period 3, APUSH in general, things like that, if we have time. But otherwise, we got some stuff to cover. So let me share my screen with you, and then we'll start going through the period 3 stuff. A quick outline of this stream. What are we going to be talking about? I want to just hit the period 3 highlights. This stream is coming a little bit early in the period 3, maybe for some of you. I know for my students, we're right in the middle of period 3. We've just finished talking about the Constitution. Constitution Day was today, right? It's the anniversary today, so that was appropriately enough. But we're continuing to talk about the Constitution this week. We have not yet gotten to the first administrations, to things like Washington and Adams and Hamilton and things like that. So I'm going to be giving you just a quick couple of things about period 3 content highlights, just to give you an idea of where we're going to go. And then I'm going to be able to give you a review of historical thinking skills, remind you what those are, and then talk about how you can apply those to period 3. And then we'll do some practice questions, because remember, all of the practice questions come from period 3. And when they come from period 3, they're going to be historical thinking skills. Sorry, let me rephrase that. All of the questions on your test that are dealing with period 3 are going to have some sort of historical thinking skill associated with it. And so that would be a good thing to be able to combine those, apply them, and make it go together. So quick period 3 content highlights. We got ourselves in the upper right-hand corner the American Revolution. Some of you asked if that was a part of it. It indeed is. Keep in mind that period 3 begins in 1754. If you are a person who knows what date 1754 represents, go ahead and throw that in the chat for me a second. Why is 1754 an important date? Go ahead and throw that in the chat. 1754. Looks like Hannah's got it first. The French and Indian War. If you want to call it something else, you can call it the 7 Years' War. That's totally fine. Helps you keep sort of a larger context for it. So the French and Indian War begins in 1754. Sounds good. And at least I'm not there yet, but maybe you are. What does the 1800 stand for? Why is that an important end date for period 3? If you think you know that one, go ahead and drop that in the chat. While we're waiting for somebody to put that in there, let's talk a little bit about period 3 content, what that involves if we're going from 1754 to 1800. It starts with the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, and that's going to be the start of period 3. It's going to end in 1800, and it looks like most of us aren't quite there yet, which is totally fine. 1800 is going to be a big deal because it is the election of Thomas Jefferson, and thus the first peaceful transfer of power in American history. We're going to go from the Federalists all the way to the Democratic Republicans. Articles of Confederation was a good guess, Hannah. Thanks for at least participating. You're making me feel like I'm not just talking to myself out here. That's fantastic. 1800 is the election of Thomas Jefferson, and many of you aren't there yet, and I'm certainly not there yet. So I'm just giving you a quick preview there, just to get a sense of where this goes. This goes from the United States is rebelling, the United States becomes a free country, but has to figure out how to rule itself, and then into the, well, now we got to figure out how this government actually works with the first couple administrations, with George Washington, our first president, and then John Adams, our second president. It'll end as soon as John Adams loses his re-election, and that'll be in 1800. Couple of big topics for you. First, as I already mentioned, is the Revolutionary War. So this is going to start with the road to the Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary War itself, and then the aftermath would be a big deal. Talking about the Constitution, figuring out how we set up the government, how the Constitution works out in real life, what are the causes, why do we need a Constitution, and that'll involve things like the Articles of Confederation that Hannah already mentioned. That'll bring up things like Shays' Rebellion, and that'll bring up the early administrations like Adams and Washington, who you see right there. And keep in mind that Adams comes second, even though he's on the left, which is a bit confusing. Apologies for that. And then lastly, the early republic. This is going to involve trade, migration, foreign relations. How does the United States exist as a country? Keep in mind, foreign relations can involve interactions with Native Americans. Those don't go away. And then talking about how we interact with the Spanish in Florida. The Spanish are also settling in California, although the United States does not touch there yet. That's part of the course that you need to know about. And then how the United States interacts with Britain and France as we find ourselves kind of sandwiched between those two places, even after the Revolutionary War. Again, you don't have to know a ton of highlights, and you don't have to know a ton of content right now. I understand a lot of people are just starting. And actually, that might be a little bit of a useful question to throw into the chat. If you could, in the chat somewhere, tell me the topic that you've most recently covered in your APUSH class, whether that be today or you're on some sort of block schedule, it was the last time you saw your APUSH teacher. What topic are you on right now? Most of my examples that I'm giving you in terms of practice questions are from early in the period, and I did that very intentionally. Looks like Hannah was talking about the Bill of Rights. Ashley's talking about the French and Indian War. Washington profile. Okay. Hannah's getting a little bit advanced. That sounds good. Let's see. We got the Anti-Federalists is maybe in the plan for some people. Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. So we're not too far ahead or too far behind. It's always good to hear that my students are right where they should be. And that sounds good. Okay. So again, a lot of my examples will be from earlier, and we'll just talk through some of these and then be able to do some other stuff. LEQ for colonization, so finishing period 2. Sounds good. Sounds good. That should not be a problem for us. We'll be able to talk about that in just a little bit as well. Thanks, Nina. All right. So historical thinking skills. While there are some other ones that are involved in APUSH, the big 3 are going to be compare, contrast, causation or cause and effect, and change and continuity over time, otherwise known as CCOT. If you have an older brother, sister, friend, cousin, whatever, who took this course a long time ago, or who perhaps took AP World, you remember when there used to be essays that were the comp essay, the comparison essay. There was the CCOT essay and things like that. These skills have been around for a while. And before I get into these too much, I should mention there are other ones as well, such as interpretation of primary and secondary sources. There is the contextualization one, and there's other sort of minor ones, but these are the really big 3 that they use to be able to frame a lot of their arguments on the exam itself and a lot of the studying that you should be doing. So perhaps some of these are rather self-explanatory now that you've seen my lovely diagrams there, but compare, contrast using that Venn diagram that doesn't overlap, unfortunately. This is comparing and contrasting 2 things. They'll often ask you, hey, why are these things similar? How are they different? And one of the reasons I think this is so important in APUSH is because in APUSH, there's so much information. You can just get absolutely overwhelmed. But if you have these sorts of historical thinking skills in mind, I think it really helps you to study better, and it helps you to take notes better. It helps you to write your essays eventually. But even on the front end, it helps you prioritize what's important. If you see things that could be compared or contrasted, that'll be important. Next is causation. And as you can see with the arrows there are maybe 3 factors in this scenario, let's just say because there's 3, that influence the rectangular event. And then there are 3 things that come out of that event. So it's a cause and effect that are going on there. And then we have CCOT, change and continuity over time. The change is how are events changing as the timeline moves, and then continuity, what things are staying the same as the timeline moves. These are the exact same historical thinking skills we're going to be using for period 3, but I want to ask you, and this is a little bit of a difficult question. Let's take it up a notch because you folks are so bright. Could you give me a compare and contrast possibility, and we'll open it up to anything you've covered so far in APUSH, but try to come up with a period 3 answer if you're there so far. What sort of compare and contrast could you potentially see happening in your class? I'll give you one as an example. You could compare and contrast the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. That would be a classic setup for what's going on. Pearl says Bacon's Rebellion and Shays' Rebellion. Fantastic. Hannah talking about Britain versus the American government. Absolutely. We have a parliament and monarchy versus this republic, this democracy that's happening with the 3 different branches and much more self-government. Absolutely. Indentured servants versus slavery. Ashley says Loyalists versus Patriots. Veronica, Ashley, Pearl, Hannah, thank you. Those are fantastic answers so far. Absolutely. Federalists and anti-federalists, says Jenna. That's absolutely true. Yeah. Indian tribes varying and responding, says Hannah. Absolutely. Yeah. The different responses that Native Americans are going to have, you can compare and contrast. Absolutely. Yeah. So you folks are getting this already. We're going to do a couple examples going forward, and I'll give you a list of a couple that I think are particularly really important and fairly widespread, at least early on. Let's go on to the causation one. Any ideas about causation or what happens because of something else? So what are the factors that cause? For instance, I'll give you an effect one, let's say. So you could say, what are the effects of the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes from the French and Indian War, right? The Proclamation Line of 1763, the end of salutary neglect, the beginning of direct taxation through the Stamp Act, and the American colonies getting a little bit resentful about that. Pontiac's Rebellion. There's a ton of effects that come from the causation of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. Any other sorts of causation questions you could think that might be useful that you've come across in your APUSH so far, particularly in period 3? Anything else where you're like, oh, we talked about a whole bunch of causes of that, or we talked about a whole bunch of effects that come from this particular event? Go ahead and drop those in the chat if you're thinking about those. Let's see, I'm looking through the chat and I'm thinking of some things we have from earlier. Could be Bacon's Rebellion might be a fantastic example. What comes from Bacon's Rebellion, right? Indians siding led to their decline. Yeah, which ones are we going with? Common sense leads to the revolution. Jenna, absolutely. That's one of my favorite jokes to make, by the way. The answer for what did Thomas Paine write that led the Americans to support the revolution? It's a common sense answer, but it might not always be easy. Absolutely. Let's see. So Iroquois and Algonquin, yep. Who are they? What are they causing? Absolutely. Jake, good to have you with us. Glad you could join us. Yeah, we're just talking about how these 3 historical thinking skills can frame your notes in period 3. We talked about how period 3 is the Revolution, the Constitution, and then the early Republic and people moving around. Nina's talking about the John Peter Zenger case, sparking the willingness to libel the British. Absolutely. We got the Tea Act leading to the Boston Tea Party. Bibi, that's a fantastic answer. Absolutely. Keep in mind, you got to have the Tea Act before you have the Tea Party, right? Now, all of those are kind of set up in that nice sequence in terms of, all right, what causes the next thing, what causes the next thing. What you also want to be thinking about, Bill of Rights would obviously be something, absolutely, Hannah, good job. Bill of Rights affects us today. One thing that you want to think about as you narrow these down is everything causes something else and is caused by something else, right? Every event has something that comes before it and comes after it. One way to sort of narrow this down is to think, what are the really, really big events that are going to have a lot of factors that influence it or have a lot of events that come from it? So that'd be one thing to think about. I'll give you some examples in just a little bit. Lastly, we have change and continuity over time. If you can think of one of those from period 3, go ahead and drop one of those in the chat as well. I'll give you one example. A change in continuity over time would be the relationship between the American colonies and the British mother country. How does that change over time? You might be talking about it from 1754, the beginning of the 7 Years' War, until, say, 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. Are there some things that stay the same? Perhaps, yeah. Enlightenment values, rights of Englishmen, that kind of stuff. But then you might be able to talk about how there was increasing patriotic sentiment, something like that. Let's see, Jake, Roe v. Wade, that's going to be in period 8 in terms of APUSH, but I don't know how necessarily your school is dealing with its chronology. Could be a little bit interesting. Did you perhaps start with at a particular date? Because Roe v. Wade, remember, is the 1970s. Did you start at like 1900 or something like that? That could be an interesting way of doing it. So other changes in continuity over time, while we're waiting for Jake to talk about that a little bit. Population varying in America, absolutely. Where are people living? They're moving west. That's a continuity. And yet how they interact with Native Americans changes, although there's a continuity of taking land from them. Absolutely. Indians and Americans or Africans, absolutely. The interaction, the triangle trade is going to continue. The transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, is unfortunately going to be a continuity until 1808. And the Indian relationship with the colonists and the Spanish, the establishment of government. Yes. The establishment of government, Hannah, good option, because you can talk about, hey, they always fear centralized authority, right? They want to have an Articles of Confederation with a weak centralized government, and yet they eventually go to the Constitution. That's a change, but the continuity is that the Constitution sets up separation of powers such that there's no dictator, things like that. The creating the Bill of Rights, that would obviously be a change over time as well. Sounds good, Hannah. Yeah, good job. So we got a variety of ones. I'll give you a couple examples as we go. Here's one, for example. If we're doing a comparison between the Loyalists and the Patriots, that would be a fairly good one to be able to talk about. So a comparison example from the Revolutionary War. Oh, nice. Okay, so sorry, I'll just interrupt myself to interact with the chat here a second. So Jake is saying Unit 1 is early North America and the Unit 2 is religion. So instead of going chronologically, they're going to talk about a topic and how it affected American history over time. So Jake is one of the lucky few that gets to do APUSH, not chronologically necessarily, but sort of thematically too. That's really cool. Awesome. That actually is very, very helpful for seeing things like change in continuity over time. And so that'll really help you. One thing that I would suggest if you are doing things thematically is really, really emphasize your date memorization. You want to know those big ones because if you talk about themes, you have a really good sense of how these themes unfold over time. You just want to make sure you know what's going on at the same time period and when things happen. But that's a fantastic approach and one that I've kind of monkeyed with myself in my brain. So that's fantastic. I'd love to know more. Let's go into this one a little bit, and I want you folks to be able to help me out here. So with comparison, it's often easier to talk about the differences than the similarities. And if you do both, you're setting yourself up for either answering a question on the short answer question that'll probably ask you for similarities and differences, and also for a long essay question that might ask you for talking about the differences. And if you mention these similarities as well, you're setting yourself up for some complexity points. So let's start in the middle there. What do the Loyalists and the Patriots have in common? Go ahead and write an answer in the chat if you think you have something that we can talk about. While we're doing that, Hannah brings up a really good point. Loyalists, 20 to 30%. Yeah, John Adams famously says he thinks about a third are Patriots in terms of North American colonists, a third are Loyalists, and a third don't care. They just don't want you to burn their crops down because you don't like what side they're not on, right? So that's a really good idea. Talking about the third. Keep in mind, not everyone's a Loyalist, not everyone's a Patriot, and certainly not all Americans are Patriots. So that's a really good thing to bring up. So what do the Loyalists and the Patriots have in common? It's a little bit of a hard question, a little bit of a difficult challenge. Talking about how there's, we could maybe talk about the rights of Englishmen, right? Even the Patriots, up until the final hour, with things like the Olive Branch Petition in 1775, say, look, we want to be able to rule ourselves. We're still willing to be loyal to the king, but Parliament keeps taxing us. And we want to be loyal, but as Englishmen, we have certain rights, and you can't just trample on us. The Loyalists would say, yeah, we have certain rights, and you need to stay loyal because the king is still granting you those rights. And even if he's not, he has good reason not to. So you could talk about Loyalists and Patriots both being loyal to the king, at least for a while, up until maybe 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. You could talk about them both wanting the rights of Englishmen. You could talk about how they're both involved in things like the triangle trade, right? So the Loyalists, one of the reasons that some people are Loyalists is because they want to continue to have access to that English mercantilist market. And then the Patriots are also involved in the trade. Think like your John Hancock, who is doing some smuggling sometimes, but also involved in a lot of trade. So they're frequently in contact with other people. There's the Republic of Letters. There's a whole bunch of Atlantic correspondence going on. People in England know what's going on in the Americas, etc. Yeah. So the Loyalists are known as Tories, as Hannah was saying. Patriots could be considered Whigs, as in not the Whig Party from the United States history. That gets kind of confusing later, but they are anti-monarchical power. They don't like the king or the monarchy having a ton of power. Both are being taxed by England. Bibi brings up a really good point. Both are under this English influence, and the difference is just how they respond, right? So Loyalists and Patriots both being taxed by England. Both are interested perhaps in moving a little bit farther west, and just one of them obeys the proclamation line of 1763, and the other one does not. Loyalists more inclined to do that than the Patriots, let's say. Sure. So that would be one example, Loyalists and Patriots, a little bit early on there. Here's our cause and effect, the Revolutionary War. Now, we can add some stuff to this as we go. So the Revolutionary War, I'll give you a couple examples. Go ahead and think of some, and I'll add a couple of my own here. One would be the end of salutary neglect. Now, a reminder, as you're thinking about other things that caused the Revolutionary War, salutary neglect was Britain not enforcing the Navigation Acts, not enforcing mercantilism, sort of allowing the American colonies to govern themselves, to do a little smuggling, looking the other way, because it wasn't necessarily in their best interest or economic self-interest to be able to enforce their codes. But after the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, then they are going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. It's the end of salutary neglect. And because they need to pay back their big national debt that they incurred through the 7 Years' War, saving the Americans behind from the French. So it's only natural the Americans should also be paying their fair share, and the colonists do not like that at all. So we have some other answers besides the end of salutary neglect. Hannah mentions the proclamation line of 1763. Absolutely. Remember that that's that line where it's on the Appalachian Mountains where the British are trying to keep the English colonists from moving into the Indian Territory and causing more problems. The English colonists they resent that. They don't like it because they want land. That's why a lot of the settlers moved here. The Second Great Awakening, absolutely. Yeah, Jake, Second Great Awakening is going to invoke abolitionism, which is going to happen a little bit later. That's going to be post-1800. But the First Great Awakening actually is really important too here, because the First Great Awakening says you can decide for yourself what the Bible says. You don't need any priest. You don't need any highfalutin person. Oh, you're good. A lot of wars, right? But there's a lot, like First Great Awakening says you can read the Bible for yourself. You don't need a priest. You don't need someone telling you what to do. And it's only a small step then to say, and we don't need a king telling us what to do because we can govern ourselves. Hannah mentioned all the different sorts of taxing that's happening, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townsend Acts, etc. Veronica, yes, that Great Awakening, like we just mentioned, that will be fantastic. Jenna's talking about the Boston Massacre. Absolutely. Boston Massacre. And then we're also going to have things like the Intolerable Acts, known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, where they shut down the port of Boston because of the Boston Tea Party, and there's soldiers everywhere. And keep that in mind. That's going to cause a lot of conflict between the United States and, I shouldn't say that yet, between the British North American colonists and Great Britain itself. The Stamp Congress, the Committees of Correspondence, fueling the fire, absolutely. All kinds of different kinds of affairs. So the Revolutionary War has a lot of causes. That is a ripe section for a question. Cause and effect of the Revolutionary War. Causation, there's all kinds of acts. There's all kinds of, common sense, Jenna? Absolutely. It's a common sense answer, but it's not always easy. And we didn't remember that until you mentioned it. Fantastic. Thomas Paine, influencing the people. That's good. That's good. So there's a lot of different causes. In fact, how it's phrased, you could even talk about the Declaration of Independence as causing the Revolutionary War. Lexington conquered, first shots fired in anger, the Olive Branch Petition being rejected. All sounds great. All sounds great. Now, this might be a little bit more difficult, but let's see if we can do effects. Here's one for you. One effect of the Revolutionary War was republicanism. Again, this idea of virtuous citizenship involving political participation. You don't want to be able to get in politics for your own power and glory. You want to be sort of disinterested, and also you want to be a representative of the people, so nobody is seeking power. It's not about monarchy. It's definitely about a republic, as in a nation of laws where the people hold sway, and there's some democracy involved there too. You could even start talking about Republican motherhood, where women during this time don't have the right to vote, but they do have the responsibility to make sure that their children grow up to either be good citizens and voting citizens in the case of males, or good advisors and good helpers to the voting citizens if they're giving birth to girls. So republicanism would be an effect. Can you think of any other effects that we might want to add to the chat? Other effects of the Revolutionary War. Making peace for the colonies. This would be the Treaty of Paris. That absolutely could work. Native Americans grouping together against the Americans. Yeah. Remember after the 7 Years' War, there's the Pontiac's Rebellion. That's going to play out over and over again as the Native Americans realize that they're stronger together because the Americans see them all as just one big monolithic other, and they want to just take their land. Keep in mind the Treaty of Paris establishes certain boundaries for the United States. As Hannah's mentioning, the Mississippi River is now the western boundary, so that's going to create all sorts of interesting questions about, does the United States have access to the Mississippi? Sure, but do we have access through New Orleans? Ooh, tricky. Who controls New Orleans? It's always a different European power. Shays' Rebellion comes from the Revolutionary War, right? Revolution is in the air. Very important to keep in mind, BB. Sounds good. The Articles of Confederation is established and created. Absolutely. Yeah, Spain controls New Orleans. We're going to eventually get that with Pinckney's Treaty and things like that. Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty. Washington's administration is all about negotiation for Florida and for the Mississippi River and New Orleans. The Army, who wanted to get paid and wanted to act on it. Remember, that's the thing called that Newburgh Conspiracy, Jenna. Fantastic. Thanks for mentioning that one. So the Revolutionary War kickstarts a whole bunch of things, some of which are a little bit, hard to think about in terms of you didn't know. that it was coming, right? The Nuremberg Conspiracy, can you stop this Revolutionary War effect? Can you stop women from requesting their rights? Can you stop slaves from insisting that they have rights? There's revolutionary sentiment in the air, and people are getting really excited. Sounds good. You folks are on a roll. You get how this works. All right, now let's go on to a CCOT type question. Notice I've made a timeline here, and it kind of has two parts to it. 1763, that really important date for a variety of reasons, but for right now, it's the 7 Years' War ends in 1763, and there's going to be a whole bunch of other things. Remember Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation Line, things like that. And this is going to go all the way until 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. Are there things that we could add that change the Americans' relationship with Great Britain that go along the way? Are there things that stay the same? We sort of mentioned this before, but one of the things that stays the same is the fact that there's still this idea of Enlightenment values, social contract theory, the rights of Englishmen, things like that could certainly be there. There's even examples of when the Stamp Act gets passed and then repealed in the 1760s, there are some people back in England who say, hey, we're glad the Stamp Act was repealed. That seemed a little bit too harsh. Yeah, so by the way, when you're talking about change and continuity over time, that is CCOT, it's often a good idea to have some sort of direction to it, right? Or some sort of action that's happening. So think of an analytic category, such as feelings of independence, or how much they don't like Great Britain, or how much they want their independence, or what they want their independence to look like. And then does that grow? Does it shrink? Does it change direction? Does it change focus? Are Americans more interested in, at the beginning of this timeline in 1763, they're actually way more interested in having their rights as Englishmen upheld under the British imperial structure. By the time we get to 1776, and if we could put this in the chat, I got a quick bonus question for you there. What large event happens in 1776 that's also really important for convincing the American colonists to support the patriotic cause? By the time we get to 1776, there's a lot of Americans who are willing to fight for it. Besides the Declaration of Independence, what other event happens? But yes, that is in 1776. There's another sort of milestone. Not really sure it's an event. As BB's got it. Fantastic. Common sense. Yes. So by the time we get to common sense that says, look, America shouldn't be ruled by an island, we've moved a long way from, hey, we would just like our rights as Englishmen, so olive branch petition and Parliament is bad, but the king is good. We've changed a lot. By 1775, we have actual armed conflict. What's the first armed conflict that happens in 1775? You know what that one is? Throw that in the chat if you can think about that one. Bunker Hill is going to be a little bit later. It's coming. It's coming. But I'm talking about the first shots fired, and that's the battles of Lexington and Concord. Indeed, indeed. Hey, it's on Hannah's birthday day. Fantastic. You can always remember that date then with lots of detail. Sounds good. So, by the way, if we go back just a little bit here, let me go back to my original slide here. These different types of charts are often really good when you have to write an essay or you want to categorize your notes. I would suggest copying these kinds of templates, not that they're super creative or super revolutionary or super new. Haha, revolutionary, period 3. But I would suggest using something like this. If you take notes in an outline form, that might work. If you take notes using some sort of spider web and a sort of brain map, mind map thing, that works too. But these will really help you to visualize what's going on. So compare, contrast using a Venn diagram, causation using arrows or things that are connected to an event and that come from an event, and then changing continuity over time, either one timeline with something on the top and bottom or 2 timelines. Either way, it's not a bad idea to be able to conceptualize it that way. So let's go back there. We talked about CCOT. We got some good answers there. Let's do some practice problems. Before we get into the practice problems, I promised you a list of various historical thinking skills that I think could be useful for us. Again, focusing a little bit on the early side, since a lot of us are sort of early into period 3. Heck, we haven't even had the French and Indian War 5-able stream yet, so tune in for that. That'll be a good review here. So some possible compare and contrast topics, as we've already talked about. Loyalists and Patriots, already did that. Articles of Confederation and Constitution, already talked about that. Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. Fantastic. And then, of course, that also means Federalists and Democratic Republicans. By the way, Quick PS. Federalists initially are started because they are pro-Constitution. That means the anti-Federalists are anti-Constitution. Once the Constitution is ratified in 1788, the anti-Federalists cease to exist. Their purpose, their raison d'etre, does not exist. I can't pronounce French, apologies there. But their reason for existing does not exist anymore. So that some of the anti-Federalists become Democratic Republicans later, think Thomas Jefferson, but some Federalists who were Federalists initially, in fact, like James Madison, wrote the Federalist Papers, hello, he's going to become a Democratic Republican. So he supports the Constitution, but he has a particular view of it. So please don't get those confused, and please don't use anti-Federalists if it's not talking about the Constitution's ratification. If it's not talking about 1787 or 1788, you shouldn't be talking about the anti-Federalists. Just as a quick aside there, something that a lot of students mess up there. Causation questions. Cause of the American Revolution. Cause of the Constitution. Why is it necessary? The Shays Rebellion type things. Articles of Confederation weak. The cause of the first party system. First party system, largely the fighting between Hamilton and Jefferson over things like the National Bank during Washington's administration. Although Washington is technically nonpartisan, he sides with Hamilton a lot, creates a lot of anger amidst people that are eventually going to become Democratic Republicans, such as Madison and Jefferson. And thus the first party system is ripe for cause and then effect, because how does this play out as the party system evolves? And it could be, and by the way, I'm keeping these problems as just in period 3. They could obviously go a lot longer. So it could be, talk about the causes and effects of American politics and parties from 1789 until 1815 or something like that. In terms of changing continuity over time, we already mentioned some of these things, but patriotic feelings as in how are people feeling about independence, the first party system, again, how does American politics change over time, and then foreign policy. Sorry if I'm cutting myself off there on the slide, but foreign policy is a big deal because now that we're a country, we have to talk about this. So the Articles of Confederation helped to get us through the Revolutionary War. The Constitution sets us up, but then we have to decide what are we going to do with the French and the British, with Native Americans, and that's continuing to be a problem all the way until about 1815 or so with the end of the War of 1812, but we're not there yet. So those are a bunch of lists of examples. And again, this often really helps if you're able to sort of conceptualize your course ahead of time this way, which is one of the reasons why I think it's not a terrible waste of time to do this particular talk right now. A lot of us haven't covered a lot of these topics yet, but if you can think about them and be aware and be looking out for opportunities to compare and contrast, opportunities for causation, opportunities for CCOT, that's really helpful because that'll help you organize your notes well, determine what's important. If you're taking notes for open note quizzes, it's useful to use these historical thinking skills because they're what the teachers are going to use to assess you and what the College Board are going to use to assess you on the AP exam. So, good idea going forward. Let's dive into a couple of practice problems. So this one right here, before we dive into the actual question itself, this is a picture of the Boston Massacre as printed by Paul Revere, a little bit of famous propaganda there. And so the question number 1 asks, incidents like the one depicted in the March 1770 image to the left led to what? So notice we have a bit of a causation question going on here. What does the Boston Massacre and incidences like it cause? Go ahead and write in the chat what letter you think the answer is. Is it A, increasing mercantilist policies via laws like the Navigation Acts? B, increasing opposition to Enlightenment political values? C, increasing calls for unity in the face of the French threat in North America? D, increasing colonial resentment of British imperial authority? Type the letter that you think it is in the chat down there. Hannah thinks it's D. Does anyone agree? Does anyone disagree? What do you think it is? Jenna thinks it's D as well. So we have 2 votes for that. Pearl agrees. 3 so far. Not quite a quorum out of the people that we have watching. BB says D as well. All right. Well, if it sounds like the answer is D, if someone could explain that, that might be helpful. So think about that and think about it to yourself. You don't necessarily have to type it in the chat because that might take too long. But the Boston Massacre is one example of an incident that leads to increased tensions between the British and the American colonists, and it's going to eventually lead to increasing colonial resentment of British imperial authority. It can't be A because the Navigation Acts were passed a long time ago, and this just doesn't make sense that the causation is reversed here. Increasing opposition to Enlightenment political values is not right because there's actually increasing Enlightenment political values. People like to support it during this time. Social contract theory, self-rule, etc. And then the French threat in North America is gone because the French and Indian War ended 7 years ago in 1763. So they're no longer around. They're not really a threat. So D is the correct answer. Nice work, folks. Let's go on to another one. Keep in mind, by the way, as you're looking at multiple choice questions, you always want to be looking at the source first. That'll often help you. So this says, essay written by Alexander Hamilton under the pseudonym Publius, October 27, 1787. Those of you that are savvy with your dates will know that 1787 is the year that the Constitutional Convention happened, and thus this is after that summer, and we're in the process of ratification. Let's read the excerpt real quick. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, and whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Yes, my countrymen, after having given it attentive consideration, I am clearly of opinion it is your interest to adopt the new Constitution. So this is clearly a pro-Constitution thing if you pay attention to that last sentence there, right? He thinks it is to your interest to adopt the new Constitution. By the way, paying attention to the first and last sentence is always good. So essays like the kind written above express the opinion of, we have A, a Federalist, B, an Anti-Federalist, C, a Loyalist, and D, an Abolitionist. It sounds like there's some people that think it's A so far. There was a couple of D's, but maybe that's from previous ones. But yeah, A is the correct answer here because Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist in that he supports the Constitution. In fact, he's one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers. If you're familiar with the musical Hamilton, and if you're not, you should be. Great way to study for period 3, and fantastic music, fantastic acting. Listen to the soundtrack. Hamilton is one of the authors of the Federalist Papers along with John Jay and James Madison. Hannah, you know, it's not for everybody, but you're entitled to your own opinion. You're welcome to be as wrong as you want. No, I'm just messing. Yeah, I love Hamilton. It's not for everybody, but in case you like certain kinds of music, I'm just messing. Yeah, some people don't really like Broadway. I respect that. I get it. Some people really don't like rapping or don't like a particular kind of music. That's totally up to you. You're welcome to have your own opinion on that. Just in case, just throwing it out there as an offer for some people. But I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. Man, the American Revolution puns keep coming. But Hannah, it sounds like you're pretty set for period 3. So you don't really need it anymore. So that's good. Yeah, Hamilton is a Federalist because he supports the Constitution. It says that in the excerpt, and the essay is one of the Federalist Papers. In fact, this comes from Federalist number 1. Let's go on to another question. Number 2, the excerpt's concern with the voice of the people reflects the effect of which of the following? So if we want to pay attention to the voice of the people, which of the following does this represent? Would that come from A, philosophical ideas from the Enlightenment, B, experiences from the 7 Years' War, C, concerns about centralized authority in the Articles of Confederation, or D, increasing opposition to slavery in northern states? What are our options here? What could we possibly have? By the way, as I'm waiting for you to answer what you think, sometimes Hamilton can get too overhyped. I would agree. Give it a listen for yourself just once, but you know, it doesn't have to be your favorite thing. Absolutely no pressure. That is one thing. When people are like, you have to see this movie, it's going to be great. You're like, whoa, I don't want to see it. That's way too overhyped. So, you know, it might not be very good. Let me really lowball it, really low sell it. Could be interesting. Yeah, see what you want. So we have A, B, C, or D. What do you think? Hannah's kind of going back and forth, but she thinks it might be A. We have some examples here. Jake seems to think it's A as well. Yeah, this was a little bit trickier. Let's go through this kind of in reverse order and see if we can process of elimination our way there and then talk about why it might be the case. So D, increasing opposition to slavery in northern states. Is there increasing opposition to slavery in northern states during this time? Sure. There's a lot of gradual emancipation happening. However, is this related to concerns with the voice of the people? Not really. B, experiences from the 7 Years' War. Again, not really the right time period, and it wasn't like there was a whole lot of voices of the people happening because of the 7 Years' War. It just doesn't really seem to make sense. So we're left with A and C. Well, there are a lot of concerns about centralized authority, but notice the entire answer for letter C. People are concerned about centralized authority in the Articles of Confederation. Is the Articles of Confederation a centralized, strong national government? The answer to that's going to be no, so the answer can't be C. Nice job, Pearl. So A is going to be the correct answer, philosophical ideas or ideals from the Enlightenment, because the voice of the people is important. Phew, you got it. Nice work. Jake's got the W. Sounds like a Cub fan out there, flying the W. But yeah, philosophical ideas from the Enlightenment. We want to make sure that the voice of the people is heard. Social contract theory. You have to listen to your constituents. Things like republicanism, things like democracy. Those are all going to play a role. Sounds good. By the way, again, notice how causation was important. Which of these would have been something that causes Alexander Hamilton to be concerned about the voice of the people? All right, we got ourselves this one. Concerns about the process mentioned above resulted in which of the following? So what is the process? Well, it's the process that we're talking about with ratifying the Constitution. So is it A, the political platform of the Federalist Party, B, the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, C, the presidency of John Adams, D, the addition of a Bill of Rights to the Constitution shortly after its ratification? Remember, we want to look at that question, slow down, make sure we understand it fully. It says concerns about the process mentioned above, as in people that are a little bit suspicious and a little bit concerned with the Constitution. Our options here are A, platform of the Federalist Party, B, Common Sense, C, John Adams, or D, the addition of the Bill of Rights. It seems like people so far are saying D. Hannah says it, Jake says it, Jenna says it. Oh, D, final answer. I feel like I'm on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Absolutely. The answer is D, yes. So the addition of a Bill of Rights. Keep in mind that there are two main items that the Federalists are going to use to get the Constitution ratified, and that is the Federalist Papers and promising a Bill of Rights to be passed shortly after it's ratified. That's a big deal. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is all about going away from the British in 1776. That's way too early, and it really doesn't have anything to do with this. The presidency of John Adams is a Federalist. He likes the Constitution. He doesn't have concerns about the ratification process necessarily, and it's not that the ratification process causes John Adams to be president. The platform of the Federalist Party is the exact opposite because they don't have concerns about the process in terms of actually ratifying. They're concerned about the Constitution not getting ratified. They want to make sure it passes, of course, but I would not say that the political platform of the Federalist Party distrusts the ratification of the Constitution. But D, the Bill of Rights, indeed, that is the one that has the Federalists promising the Anti-Federalists that they will pass a Bill of Rights if the Anti-Federalists agree to pass the Constitution. And it barely squeaks by. And it's going to be squeaking by mainly in the big two states of New York and Virginia, without whose support the country probably would not have been able to survive very well. Because without the two biggest economies, two biggest states with a lot of power, the Constitution doesn't have a whole lot of power. So those are the multiple choice questions. Let's go on to some short answer questions. These are really nice when it comes to historical thinking skills. This is a comparison one. And again, this is an artificial exercise, so I'm trying to give you 3 different ones just to give you a variety of options here. So they might not all go together necessarily, and they wouldn't be on the exam together. But let's look at this one. Briefly describe one specific similarity between the government created by the Articles of Confederation and the one created by the Constitution. B, describe a specific difference between the government created by the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And C, briefly describe one specific reason for the difference you mentioned in Part B. This one kind of works together. Let's start with letter A. What is a specific similarity between the government created by the Articles of Confederation and the one created by the Constitution? Go ahead and write that in the chat if you think you have a good answer for that one. You can just go ahead and drop the phrase or the vocab word. You don't have to write like a full-on essay here right now. We'll kind of talk about this as the results roll in. A similarity between the government created by the Articles of Confederation, the one that gets us through the war, and the one created by the Constitution. When you think of a similarity, Again, it might be nice to start really broad, and as you're thinking and as you're typing, let me just start there. We have very broadly Enlightenment values, right? Ideas that people should be able to determine who their representatives are, that there's a social contract. So you could talk about how neither of these has a monarch. Neither has a king, right? They both have a Congress or a legislative branch, says BB. That's a fantastic answer. In fact, that's all the Articles of Confederation has, right? No executive, no judicial branch. Ooh, looks like we've just stumbled into an answer for letter B. Fantastic. But yeah, they both have a legislative branch. Remember, in the Articles of Confederation, each state gets one vote there, whereas in Congress, it's bicameral, like two humps, like a camel, two humps. You got the Senate. Every state has two. The House, every state is proportional to population. That's what's known as the Connecticut Plan or the Great Compromise. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. Let's see, two parties emerged. Both had disagreements, as always. Could you explain that a little bit more? So there's two parties in the Constitution, right? The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Are you saying that the Articles of Confederation also has two different parties? It could be that we have... well, I guess we could say we have like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. That could work. That comes out of the Articles of Confederation. Yeah. Or more like sides. Yeah, we're certainly going to have disagreements for sure as we go. Yeah. Jake, thanks for talking about me as the GOAT, although make sure you're spelling my name right. Has an EY at the end there. But thanks. Appreciate it. Let's see. We have, or maybe it's two GOATs. Uh-oh. Don't know what that means. Going to need to be paying attention to that. Let's go on to letter B. What's the difference between the government created by the Articles of Confederation and the one created by the Constitution? This one seems like there's more options. So in the similarities, we said, okay, they don't have a monarch. They all have sides and differences, especially in the legislative branch. But letter B, I'm glad, Jake. Just messing. Letter B, we're asking for a difference. So what's a difference in the Articles of Confederation? We said one of them is that the Constitution actually has a separation of powers and multiple branches, not just a legislative branch. That's one of those. Is there another difference that we could throw into the chat between the Articles and the Constitution? Let's see. I'm thinking here. We got states being disproportionate, kind of like what we talked about earlier. Is it one per state, or is it going to be by population? The Constitution has both. The Articles of Confederation only has one vote per state, whereas the Constitution sets up the Senate having two. Any other differences that we can think of? Trying to make sure I give you some time to think, some time to type as you go into the chat. Vicky mentions the bicameral and unicameral House. Absolutely, yeah. So the Articles of Confederation, unicameral, one body, only one part of the legislature, whereas in the Constitution they have two, the House and the Senate. Yeah. If you were to talk about authority and power, which of those two, the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation, has a stronger national government, and which one is stronger for state government? That's a question that might be useful for us here. The Articles of Confederation started during the Revolutionary War, when each state is jealously guarding its own autonomy, self-rule, initiative. The Constitution is going to be a little bit later, following Shays' Rebellion and other such things that are going to propel it to be a little bit more centralized. So you could talk about that. The Articles of Confederation is going to be a lot looser, and it's a firm league of friendship, which in the words of John Green only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes, right? The firm league of friendship just means that it's not going to be very coercive from the national government. They can't force taxes on people, and they also are not going to be able to take away the autonomy, the self-rule, or the independence of the individual states. The Constitution, by contrast, is going to have a stronger centralized government. Letter C, what's the reason? Let's just dwell on that one for a second. Why is the Constitution in letter C going to be having a stronger national government? What sort of events or ideas or people or processes make the Constitution need to have a stronger centralized government? We have a variety of options that we could go to. One of the ones I already mentioned was Shays' Rebellion. Remember, the Articles of Confederation government is seen as too weak and not able to control the population. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to have this idea of Shays' Rebellion. Jenna's got Shays' Rebellion down. Fantastic. That's good to know. Want to make sure that Shays' Rebellion is a part of your vocabulary. Sorry, I went back a little bit too far. The Constitution is a little bit stronger with the national government, partly just because they recognize they need to be able to protect themselves for national defense against an outside force, and they also need to have more revenue. They need to be able to collect some taxes, and the Articles of Confederation could ask the states nicely for taxes, but when's the last time you asked someone nicely and they said, yes, I'll give you money? Doesn't quite work out that way. Long-term gain, sure, but short-term harm, people don't like it too much. You could mention the Newburgh Conspiracy, absolutely. So, yeah, the Newburgh Conspiracy is one of the reasons why they say, hey, we need to have some more power over the national military, the standing army, the Continental Army. Oh, boy, we got to have some more power here. Make sure that we don't have people going power hungry and power mad. So that's an example of a comparison SAQ. You can think about those. There's a variety of ways to answer that, and that's just one example for you. Another one would be causation. Sample short answer question number 2 would be causation. Could you describe a specific motivation for the British North American colonists' frustration with British rule from 1763 to 1776? You know what? There's a typo in there. I'm going to fix that right now because I know some of you are getting really bothered by that, and you're like, oh, man, Mr. Larway, you got to fix this right now. It's colonists, and it's possessive. So let's make sure we fix that. So Hannah says this is partly because they're tired of taxation. That absolutely works. Vicky, taxation without representation. That will absolutely work. Sounds good. Any other reason that they are upset with this? The end of salutary neglect. Yes. The example I like to use with my students is if I don't give my AP students a seating chart. I say, hey, you're an AP, you work hard. That's one of the perks you get, one of the rewards you get. But if I gave you a seating chart and just slapped it on you right now in the middle of period 3, the 4th or 5th week of the school year, oh man, like that'd be out of nowhere. And again, do I have the right to give you a seating chart as the teacher? Absolutely. That's one of the things that I'm allowed to do. A lot of teachers do it. But if I were to slap it on you week 5, you might be a little resentful because we haven't had that so far. Or if you can't relate to that because your teacher gives you a seating chart, perfectly fine, legitimate reason to have seating charts, absolutely. There might be other things. Think about those times when you're like, oh man, everything good happens after I leave and everything bad happens to my class or my grade. And that always happens. There's just some resentfulness about things that happen, even if they're legitimate, but if it happens to you and it's just bad timing, you don't like it. Folks, if the option for motivation of the British North American colonists' frustration with British rule goes from 1763 to 1776, a motivation for frustration could be common sense, which comes out in 1776. A motivation could be Lexington and Concord, which happens in 1775. A motivation could be the Stamp Act, any of those acts. Fantastic examples. Let's talk about B. What is a specific reason for the success of the British North American colonists in the American Revolution? Why does America win the American Revolution? What sort of options do we have there? Great leadership under George Washington, says Vicky. Fantastic. That's a good example. Yes. So George Washington manages not to lose for quite a while, holds the Continental Army together and the local militias. He manages to finesse that whole thing. That's a big deal. Yeah. And he manages, again, not to get captured, not to lose, and he's fighting a war of attrition. That's a great way to answer it. Any other answers for letter B? My Hamilton fans out there will know about Washington waiting for a guy named Lafayette, who's in Chesapeake Bay. So Jenna's mentioning the help from the French. Fantastic. The help from the French. Influence of common sense. Paul Revere, the Tea Party. Yeah. Sorry. We're going back a little bit, Hannah, with that. Yeah. Common sense. Paul Revere with the Boston Tea Party. That's going to be a great answer for A. Sounds good. So Jenna's talking about help from the French. That absolutely is a reason for success. The French provide basically our entire Navy. That's going to be a big deal. Another reason we win is because there's a lot of patriots who are really fired up about this cause, including ladies. Remember, there's not only the Sons of Liberty, there's the Daughters of Liberty. There's going to be ladies who help to be able to sew things for the American Revolution. We're not just talking that fake story about Betsy Ross sewing the flag, but we're also talking about American women who would serve Molly Pitcher, right, who serves in the Army, people who take care of wounded soldiers, people who, excuse me, yeah, people who are doing all sorts of things to help out the colonists with crops, with spying. Hercules Mulligan, that spy on the inside, feeding us intelligence from British-occupied New York City, and that makes sense. So the variety of reasons there. And then lastly, letter C, briefly describe one specific effect, cause and effect, of the American Revolution on American society from 1776 to 1790. Any options for letter C, go ahead and throw those in the chat. What's an effect of the American Revolution on American society? How does it change us as a country and as a society? America is now an independent nation. Hannah, that's a great one, for sure. Vicky's talking about a strong sense of nationality. That'll work. We have a strong sense of national pride. We become more educated because of schools, Pearl says. Absolutely. Think of things like the Northwest Ordinance that literally sets aside a strip of land for a common school, a public school. That's a big deal. The rise of Republican motherhood, says BB. Fantastic answer. The American Revolution says, hey, you got to be your own virtuous citizens. And ladies, your responsibility is not to vote, yet awkward and kind of sexist, but you get to raise men to be better citizens, whether they be your sons or your husbands. Well, that's something at least. So that's Republican motherhood, virtuous women. Creating a new government that other countries would model, like Haiti and France, says Hannah. Absolutely. The American Revolution reverberates around the Atlantic world. If you've taken AP World History, you know all about this. That's a great comparison essay right there. It was on the essay a few years ago, or on the exam a few years ago for AP World. But yeah, you got to know that the American Revolution is going to inspire a slave rebellion and revolution in Haiti. It's going to inspire the French Revolution in the 1790s, and that's going to have impacts on American history, both Haiti and the French Revolution. For sure. You could talk about how America is really concerned with its independence and guarding its independence, and how it's going to be a big deal in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars that are happening later. So when we're caught between France and England that are both fighting each other in the 1790s around the time of the French Revolution, we have to decide how we're going to handle that. That's one option for you. I think we have time for one last short answer question. Then I'll throw you a couple of LEQs as well, long essay questions. This short answer question, talking about the specific way the relationship between the British and the Americans changed between 1763 and 1775. We talked about this one a whole lot already in the midst of this stream. So talk about the various acts, right? The taxation, the violence that happens. That's a way that it changes. B, how does it stay the same? Keep in mind that people up until 1775 and the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition, they're still pretty loyal to the king. And they might want their rights as Englishmen, and they might not like Parliament, but they're very interested in staying loyal as long as they can have their rights. And then letter C, this is kind of a preview of things that maybe you haven't covered yet, because it sounds like we haven't. A specific way the goals of the United States foreign policy stayed the same between 1789 and 1800. One could just say maintaining one's independence and being able to rule yourself without interference from Great Britain. But in order to talk about some of that later stuff, you might need to mention the XYZ affair or the British impounding our ships or things like that, impressment. But that'll be a little bit later. So an example of change in continuity over time, questions that you can potentially answer. A long essay question that could be about this: evaluate the extent to which events influenced American colonial reactions to British imperial authority. So again, a causation question, but also a little bit of a CCOT. How are American colonists reacting to British imperial authority from the beginning of the 7 Years' War up until the Declaration of Independence? That's an option. LEQ number 2. The extent to which political debates divided the United States from 1785 to 1800. So we're talking before the Constitution all the way up until the end of John Adams' presidency. And that's kind of a big deal there too. So it could be a CCOT question, could be a compare-contrast question. Just throwing out a couple examples for you there. And then one more, the extent to which early American political parties differed from each other from 1789 to 1800. Early Americans, we're talking Federalists versus not anti-Federalists, because we're past the ratification phase, but the Democratic Republicans. Washington is kind of in the middle, but he's a little bit on the Federalist side. It's mostly Hamilton versus Jefferson and Madison. Hamilton is also joined by John Adams, etc. So just wanted to give you a couple examples there. Again, if you have a 500 Plus subscription, you can always go back and check out these slides later. You can use them when you're studying for your tests, or just to take notes, or to think about what's really important as I come across things later as we cover period 3. So don't have a ton of time left, but any pressing concerns or questions that you really wanted answered about period 3 that I can help to answer while I'm here? I know we're already past the hour mark, so thanks for sticking with me if you already have. And if you need to get going, I understand. But I just wanted to make sure that we didn't have anybody with any pressing questions, things that I mentioned that were really, really confusing that you wanted to make sure that I could answer or clarify for you. There's the opportunity to ask a question, as always, as well as the chat, which has been very active all night. Thanks for your participation there. That's been really good. It seems like we're doing okay. I'm not seeing anything so far. Good, good. Then one last thing that I'll share with you folks is this. I always like to end my streams with this. Hey, you folks got what it takes. Even if you're struggling right now and you're like, man, I feel like APUSH is kind of burying me. Remember to have that growth mindset. You're maybe not doing great at APUSH yet. You can do better. Continue to work hard. You got this. Take care of what you got, which in this case is APUSH. We're all in this together, and we here at Five Below are here to help you. So tune in again. We'll have a couple streams coming up and be able to help you out with the rest of the period 3 and, of course, the rest of APUSH as well. So thanks for joining us tonight. Have a great night. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for helping us out in the chat. Hannah, Pearl, Vicky, fantastic. Have a great rest of your night, and good luck with the rest of your APUSH. Have a good night.